Shalom, I'm Rabbi Michael Panitz, speaking to you from the pulpit of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia. It's Wednesday, January 20th, 2021. Today is our inauguration day as a nation, and of course that influences my message as well. Tonight I'll be speaking on the subject of Exodus from a doubly narrow place. Doubly narrow place. First, an interesting coincidence. A few weeks ago, we had a workman come to the garage, and we needed to open up a path so that he could get to a particular panel for electrical work. And in order to make that walking easier for him, we noticed a few cartons that needed to be moved. And when we moved them, we saw that they were cartons filled with books. My parents of blessed memory had amassed a library of over 10,000 volumes. And when they passed away, it fell to me to find homes for the books. And many of the books went to the local Virginia Wesleyan College to help it augment its Jewish studies section. Some books went to rabbinical seminaries and Jewish summer camps and so on. And some of the books came home with us. As it turned out, I took a few more books than I had bookshelf space for. And so these particular books were sitting in cartons for all those years, and I had simply turned to other things until I found them again. One of the books that I took out of the carton was published in 1964 by the great psychoanalyst Erich Fromm. The Heart of Man. Very interesting psychological study of the forces that impel us to good or to evil. And as I began to read it, week by week, we also had the weekly procession of Torah readings, and we got into the story of slavery in Egypt, the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh, and ultimately the Exodus. So Dr. Fromm's analysis of the forces that prompt us to good or to evil was very much in my thinking as I was rereading the book of Exodus, and then it hit me that one of his key insights so well explains what's going on there. Fromm speaks about narcissism and the different forms that it takes. Some are more benign, and everyone has a certain degree of it, but some are malignant. He spoke about malignant narcissism. And it seems clear that even though we don't have a full portrait of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, what we do have is sufficient for us to understand that if ever there was a malignant narcissist, it was this Pharaoh. So I will read to you a few of Fromm's excerpts, and then I'll read to you a few of the verses from the book of Exodus and show you how they fit together. Fromm wrote, "The Egyptian pharaohs, the Roman Caesars, the Borgias, Hitler, Stalin, Trujillo, they all show certain similar features. They have attained absolute power. Their word is ultimate judgment of everything, including life and death. There seems to be no limit to their capacity to do what they want. They are gods, limited only by illness, age, and death." So the absolute power of these rulers, of whom Pharaoh is the first example, is one point. But it gets sharper and closer. the narcissistic person's judgment is biased against that which is not he or not his. The extraneous world is inferior, dangerous, immoral. He and his are over-evaluated. Everything else is under-evaluated. And Fromm concludes the damage to reason and objectivity is obvious. An even more dangerous pathological element in narcissism is the emotional reaction to criticism of any narcissistically cathexed position. The narcissistic person reacts with intense anger when he is criticized. He feels that criticism is a hostile attack, since by the very nature of his narcissism, he cannot imagine that it is justified. From Caligula to Nero to Stalin and Hitler, we see the narcissist's need to find believers, to transform reality so that it fits their narcissism, and to destroy their critics. And that leads him into a discussion of social narcissism, because it's not only a pathology of the ruler, it's an unholy connection between the ruler and the majority that supports him. Fromm points out that in Nazi Germany, the most ardent support for Hitler came from the lower middle class. And then he spoke about the most ardent resistance to civil rights in America in his day, 1964, also lower middle class in the American South. And he wrote, "In both instances, the core of the racial superiority feeling was, and still is, the lower middle class. This backward class, without any realistic hope of changing its situation, because they are the remnants of an older and dying form of society, has only one satisfaction: the inflated image of itself as the most admirable group in the world, and of being superior to another racial group that is singled out as inferior. The member of such a backward group feels, even though I am poor and uncultured, I am somebody important, because I belong to the most admirable group in the world. I am white, or I am an Aryan." And of course, knowing the damage that was done in our body politic just 2 weeks ago, we can see that this analysis is not confined to 50 years ago or 75 years ago. Fromm continues, "If the narcissism of a group is wounded, then we find the same reaction of rage which we have discussed in connection with individual narcissism. Violation of the flag, insults against one's own god, emperor, leader, the loss of a war and of territory, these have often led to violent mass feelings of vengeance, which in turn led to new wars. The wounded narcissism can be healed only if the offender is crushed, and thus the insult to one's narcissism is undone." So here's a description by a believing man, but preeminently a psychiatrist, of a particular disease of the human spirit. Let's now see how this stacks up against what the Bible tells us concerning Pharaoh of Egypt. A few verses. Exodus chapter 5, verse 2. Moses first confronts Pharaoh and says, "The God of the Hebrews has appeared to me and has commanded me to say to you, 'Let my people go, that they may serve me.'" Pharaoh's first response, "Vayomer Paro, mi Adonai asher eshma bekolo l'shaleach et Yisrael, lo yadati et Adonai, v'gam et Yisrael lo ashaleach." Pharaoh said, "Who is this God that I should listen to what he has to say? to send forth the people Israel. I don't know this God, and I'm not going to send forth the Israelites. That was his first response. As the plagues continue, and he negotiates with Moses most unwillingly and most insincerely, finally, after the 9th plague, he says to Moses, and this is Exodus chapter 10, 29, Vayomer lo Paro lech me'alai, hishamer lecha, al tosef ra'ot panai, ki biyom ra'otcha panai tamut. Pharaoh said to him, depart from me. Be very careful. Don't ever look on my face again. On the day that I see you, you will die. A threat, a naked threat. But then, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh sang a different tune. Vayikra leMoshe u'leAharon laila vayomer. This is Exodus 12:32. He summoned Moses and Aaron by night, and he said, Kumu tseu mitoch ami, up and leave from the midst of my people, ulechu ivdu et Adonai kidaberchem, and go serve the Lord as you have said. And then he adds, and this is really the point of surrender, uverachtem gam oti, and bless me too. So there are many other verses, but I want to focus on those. Note the arrogance of the Pharaoh's initial stance. He doesn't recognize God. This is the ultimate arrogance. He's saying that there is no reality that exists that is greater than himself. This is idolatry. This is Pharaoh believing that he himself is divine. And then his callousness towards other people flows from his narcissism. Because he doesn't recognize God, therefore he won't let the Israelites have even a moment of freedom. Their need to worship, their need to have human dignity means nothing to him. When he's challenged, and this is the point of the second verse that I quoted, when he's challenged, he threatens violence. He cannot bring himself to admit defeat. To admit defeat would somehow puncture his sense of himself as someone who always wins. He can't possibly lose. He's the Pharaoh. But God is no human enemy. God is God. And so even the Pharaoh is finally brought low. But he only does so when he is afraid for his own skin. After all, was not the Pharaoh himself most likely a firstborn? The plague of the firstborn that he saw with his own eyes, that he heard the cry of wailing coming from every house in Egypt. How long would it be before death caught him in its grip? So only because of fear of his own imminent death was his narcissism shaken for a moment, and he admits that Moses, working on God's behalf, has the ability to bless him too. And of course, it didn't last long. A few days past that, and he's already chasing the Israelites, catching them at the shores of the sea, but then being prevented from recapturing them or killing them. So the Pharaoh does appear as a narcissist, as Dr. Fromm has analyzed it. Now, back to the expression doubly narrow place. The word Mitzrayim in Hebrew, the word for Egypt, has a particular grammatical form. The ayim ending in the word Mitzrayim means two. So it's whatever the word Misr means times two. So what could that mean? Well, historically, it might mean that there were two kingdoms. We know this from ancient history. There was Upper Egypt and there was Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt went from the cataract of the Nile, that is the border with Sudan, north to the beginning of the Nile Delta. And Lower Egypt was the Nile Delta all the way up to the Mediterranean. And thousands of years ago, those two kingdoms were united into the Pharaonic kingdom of Egypt. So maybe it's Mitzrayim in the dual because it was two kingdoms. Or maybe it's a geographical term. Maybe it refers to what part of the country was arable. Think about the map. You've got the Nile, this long ribbon of life-giving water, and two narrow strips of vegetation, of arable land, one on either side of the Nile, and then uninhabitable desert to the east and to the west. So maybe Mitzrayim means double narrow strip, because Mem Tzadi Resh means constriction, a narrow place. And that second meaning gives rise to the spiritual possibility. Maybe Mitzrayim was called that because the soul was doubly constricted. The body was constricted by slavery, and the soul was constricted by the idolatrous social narcissism of the Egyptians, who said, "We are slaves to Pharaoh, but we're better than you. You are slaves to us. You are slaves of slaves. You're less than nothing. You're hardly human. Your life doesn't count. Your death is not on our conscience." So that was perhaps the double exodus that's referred to in Yitziat Mitzrayim, the going out of the dual place of narrowness. Now we in America, to close the circle and finish where we began, we are celebrating today an exodus from a different Mitzrayim, likewise in two senses. Our democracy is celebrating an exodus from the mortal threat posed by anti-democratic violence just 2 weeks ago, when a crazed, incited, angry, xenophobic, racist mob trashed our citadel and our secular temple of democracy. So our democracy is enjoying an exodus. And I dare to hope that our ideal of a tolerant society is also enjoying an exodus from the threats of racism and xenophobia. The exodus is a story for its own day, but also for our day as well. Shalom.